Welcome back to A-Star Science. This is part of our GCSE Must Know Biology series. Today we're going to talk about a really important and useful topic that comes up in the biology GCSE, comes up in foundation paper, higher paper, and of course also in separate paper as well. It's cell transport. There are three types of cell transport that you're expected to know for GCSE. The first one is diffusion, the second one is osmosis, and the third one is active transport. We're going to talk about all of them today. So on the screen, you'll see my drawing of a root hair cell, which is a typical cell that you may be asked a question about concerning the cell transport. It's useful to use because the root hair cell, as we know, is found in plant roots, and plant roots are in soil, and so they have to take up things like water and ions, and even the cells can take in oxygen. So when we look at the three different types of cell transport, let's first start with diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of particles from a high concentration to a low concentration. So you see I set particles in there because we're going to differentiate that between water and particles. So for example, if we look at the oxygen, which is the red axis, you can see that there is oxygen on the outside of the cell and there is oxygen on the inside of the cell. Diffusion is the movement of particles from a high concentration to a low concentration. Well, how can we tell? Well, there are clearly more X's on the outside of the cell than there are on the inside of the cell. And so we're going to get a movement of oxygen into the cell because the higher concentration is on the outside of the cell and is going to move into the cell. Now, an important part that we need to add to our definition is across a semi-permeable, which means it has holes in it, membrane. And so the cell wall has tiny, tiny, tiny holes in it for very small particles like oxygen molecules that can get into that cell. So that's what diffusion is. They would diffuse into the cell from a high concentration to a low concentration across a semi-permeable membrane. This is going along a concentration gradient. You can also hear it talked about that way. The concentration gradient means high to low. It's going with a concentration gradient. Now let's look at osmosis and see what the difference is with osmosis. Osmosis and diffusion is very, very similar to each other, but there's one word that we need to change. So osmosis, again, is the movement of water from a high concentration to a low concentration. Don't forget, we need to add that term in at the end, across a semi-permeable membrane, meaning a membrane that has holes in it. A membrane is simply a covering to something. And in this case, the cell membrane is the part of the cell that exists underneath the cell wall in a plant cell. So osmosis is movement of water from a high concentration to a low concentration across a semi-permeable membrane. So if we look at the water is in the blue here, and there's lots of water molecules on the outside of the cell, and there's some on the inside of the cell as well. That water, because it's a higher concentration on the outside, will naturally move in via osmosis, which is just another form of diffusion. So that's going to move into the cell from a high concentration, where it is on the outside, into the cell to a low concentration across a semi-permeable membrane. Osmosis and diffusion are very similar, except that one is with particles of gas, for example, and the other is with water molecules. Finally, let's look at active transport and how active transport is different than osmosis and diffusion. So active transport is very important both to plants and to animal species. Active transport is a type of transport in cells, which is movement against a concentration gradient. Now, what do we mean by that? Meaning this time, the particles will move from a low to high concentration. Now, how does that happen? So if we look at the mineral ions, we can see that clearly the ones in purple, the dots in purple, there are more of them on the inside of the cell than there are on the outside of the cell. Minerals are very important for plants. They need minerals in order to grow and to grow healthily. And we know that we can get lots of minerals from plants. Some of the different vitamins and minerals, as we know, come from plants, which are very important for our health. So how do these plants take them in? Well, they take them in through the roots, and they do this via active transport. So even though there is a higher number of purple dots on the inside of the root hair cell, the plant is going to use active transport to move the mineral ions into the cell. Now, we said that osmosis and diffusion work with a concentration gradient or down a concentration gradient, but active transport works against. How does the plant do that? It does this using energy. So active transport involves the use of energy. The other two types, which were diffusion and osmosis, are called passive transport. Passive meaning without. And in this case, it's without energy because they move down the concentration gradient. They don't require energy like active transport does. Whereas active transport uses energy. And many of the cells where you'll see active transport being used will have organelles such as more mitochondria available to provide this energy for movement. So you'll see this in many of the cells where active transport is important. So before we end the video, let's look at where these cell transport types are important. We already saw an example in plants, for example, with the root hair cell, where diffusion, osmosis, and active transport may be important. But how about in animals, especially in the animal of a human? Well, one of the important examples that you may see in an exam is in the lungs, in the alveoli. So the alveoli is where gas exchange takes place. And as we know, oxygen can come into the alveoli when we breathe in. And carbon dioxide is in our body because we use oxygen for respiration, and that produces carbon dioxide. This oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged through diffusion. So because there is less oxygen in the blood than there is in the lungs, this oxygen will then diffuse into the bloodstream from the lungs, from a high concentration to a low inside the bloodstream. Diffusion will take place of the oxygen. And because there is more carbon dioxide in the bloodstream than there is in the lungs, it will cause diffusion out of the bloodstream of the carbon dioxide back into the alveoli, which we then can breathe out and exchange as a waste gas. Another place in the human body where cell transport is important, and in this case it's active transport, it's in the small intestine. Now, many of the molecules are able to diffuse from the small intestine into the bloodstream, which I've tried to put here in red. But some of the food molecules, some of the digested nutrients are just a bit too big. And so the body uses active transport to go from that low concentration to a higher concentration. And that, of course, requires energy to be used across the cell membrane. So it's a really important process that takes place in the body as well.